In our first tale of dark temptation, a cry pierces the night.
We can't believe this happened in this quiet community.
Husband and wife attacked as they sleep.
It was a horrible, horrible sight.
Behind the brutality is a deadly game where no one wins.
We're just playing, and nobody's going to take us serious. But they were dead serious.
And later, innocent child's play
The mother preferred girls, and he wasn't a girl.
turns into a lifelong craving.
This is forbidden fruit, and I'm going to punish you for looking at it.
And when temptation festers, it will eventually burst. In the charming town of Little Washington, North Carolina, a family celebrates their success.
Going?
No, that's enough for a young lady.
It's 1988, and like many people, the 80s has been a golden time for Leith von Stein.
The family was somewhat wealthy.
Can you stop filming?
My father had inherited a significant sum of money from his parents when they had died.
Smile, loser.
Leith von Stein was worth almost $2 million.
Cheers. Cheers.
To top it off, Leith has married the love of his life, Bonnie Pritchard, becoming a generous stepfather to her two children, 18-year-old Angela and 19-year-old Chris.
We liked Leith. Leith was a good man. He was very kind to us. He treated us like we were his own children.
Chris had a nice car to drive around and nice clothes, and Angela was the same way.
But all the money in the world can't keep you safe from harm.
Bonnie called 911, and there was an immediate response to the von Stein residence.
On July 25th, 1988, police enter the von Stein home.
It didn't take long for them to realize that this was a major crime scene.
Detective John Taylor of the Washington Police is one of the first on the scene.
When I first got there, the downstairs seemed relatively normal, other than the glass at the back door being broken, where the door was forced open.
He soon realizes this is not your average crime scene.
When they first entered the house, they had noticed several cats and a rooster. Then the investigators and first responders made their way upstairs.
In the master bedroom, a bloodbath.
There was splatters of blood on the walls, the ceiling. Tremendous amount of blood on the bed. Bonnie was on the floor and Leith was on the bed. It was immediately apparent it was a violent death.
Leith von Stein has been beaten and stabbed.
He was dead, no sign of life at all.
He had been stabbed in his back multiple times over his heart and one time in his chest.
A knife wound deep in her chest. Wife Bonnie barely clings to life.
It was such a horrific scene that even veteran police officers had a problem dealing with it.
It looks like a brutal robbery. There's just one problem. Nothing's missing.
didn't appear to be anything that was disturbed anywhere else except at the back door where the glass was broken and upstairs in the bedroom.
Searching the rest of the house, police officers make another surprising discovery.
And they found Angela was still asleep in her bedroom, had slept through the attack.
How could anyone sleep through such a violent ordeal?
There were always questions among the officers that were there as to whether it was unusual for a person to have slept through that occurrence.
And why was Angela left unscathed?
It's a small town. Everybody talked. She had to know, and somebody had to let them in the house.
I think the police actually did think she was a suspect because she was unharmed. But I think also at one point they thought my mom was the suspect because she survived.
Bonnie von Stein is the next in line for Leith's fortune.
Like any murder, you have to try to eliminate people from suspicion. And something like this, you need to start with the family.
You start looking for the usual motives: money, jealousy, revenge.
$2 million is a potent temptation. Could Bonnie's injuries be a cover for this crime?
My husband may be dying.
There was a lot of talk about whether Bonnie was involved or whether Angela was involved.
What about the fourth member of this family, Bonnie's son, Chris? He was 100 miles away, playing a board game with friends in his college dorm. And he backs up his sister's alibi.
She always slept with a fan on. It was an old, noisy thing. She slept with noise. She needed noise to go to sleep. So she actually slept through the crime.
Police put mother and daughter through a lie detector test. Both pass with flying colors.
I don't believe Bonnie had any prior knowledge, any knowledge at all, or anything to do with the murder.
Investigators have run out of leads until a week later, when a local farmer reports an eerie light in the woods the night of the murder.
He was going to check on his hogs. Well, he was driving down the road and he saw this fire on the side of the highway. So he stopped to kind of see what it was all about. It turns out that it was a bundle of clothing and a knife and a map.
The map was hand-drawn with an X over Leith's house.
The map proves this murder was planned. But these crumbling fragments of paper will also draw detectives into a dark temptation where fractured fairy tales really do come true.
It talks about the evil prince, and killing the evil prince, you get the treasure.
Temptation can dig its claws into the most unlikely places. In 1988, in Little Washington, North Carolina, the suburban streets are bristling with fear.
People in the community were worried, they were scared. We've got this horrible murder, and we don't know who's responsible for it.
Wealthy businessman Leith von Stein has been brutally murdered in his bed. His wife, Bonnie, is barely alive after the attack.
Bonnie did remember seeing somebody, did remember seeing the shadow figure, walking up towards her and stabbing her. She lost consciousness after that.
Bonnie can't identify her attacker, but investigators have one clue: a partially burned map salvaged from the woods.
It was very apparent that that map was involved with the murder.
Washington police decide to focus on people close to the von Stein family. They discover son Chris has some shady friends.
I would say we were friends, except that I didn't really know anything about that. Our friendship was primarily based on the game Dungeons & Dragons.
In his freshman year at college, Chris took up an unusual hobby.
He was looking for something, maybe an avenue for escapism, or maybe he was looking for acceptance by his fellow classmates.
It was in a flyer I saw posted inviting anyone who wanted to play to come and play a game of Dungeons and Dragons.
With the internet still a distant dream, Dungeons and Dragons is one of the few ways to escape the monotony of the real world.
That there is the Hall of Bones. Wind up there, and you're dead.
Dungeons and Dragons is the first and original role-playing game. It's set in a fantasy world. The players each play a character.
We should enter through the forest of darkness.
The dragons there are way too high level for you, man.
Yeah, but I have a +10 flaming sword.
These characters typically fall into swords and sorcery fantasy archetypes. So there might be an elf or a dwarf or a fighter or a wizard or a thief character.
Ethan Gilsdorf is a subculture expert and self-confessed geek. He says Dungeons and Dragons was a hit for teenagers seeking a new high.
It was really a cultural phenomenon in the 80s.
We can sneak up and backstab the guards.
It allows people to do things that they can't do in real life.
I could be someone else. I could always be someone else. I never had to be the same person every time. If I didn't like who I was, I could change that. Just like that.
The characters over time accumulate more wealth, they might accumulate magical items or become more proficient in their skills, and over time they are able to defeat more powerful monsters or become successful in more complicated scenarios.
Not everyone in the 1980s embraces this strange game.
Well, at the time when Dungeons & Dragons first appeared, some highly conservative Christian groups decided that they thought it was an activity that would encourage kids to get lost in the game in a way that was unhealthy, that would actually cause them to have a break with reality.
Chris Pritchard and his college pals take their role-playing to new depths.
We began acting out some of our games in the steam tunnels underneath the college. We used wooden weapons typically used in martial arts training for katas.
They would dress up, have their fake swords and stuff, and would act the game out.
The game actually did give me a sense of empowerment. It was the only place I really had empowerment.
The player with the greatest power, James Upchurch.
James Upchurch had a lot of influence over Chris.
Upchurch calls the shots as the group's dungeon master.
There is one player called the Dungeon Master who devises a kind of scenario for the players.
The dungeon master and a roll of the dice determines what happens to your character.
The dungeon master is letting this game get out of control. The players start to lose their grasp on what's real and what's not.
Things got much more intense with the game. I had become much more enamored of fantasy over reality.
Their class attendance wasn't that good. They would rather spend more time playing Dungeons and Dragons or partying than actually going to classes.
Did some of these fanatics want a real-life adventure? Police put the heat on the D&D devotees, and one of them cracks.
The big break came when they had confronted Neil Henderson.
When he told us he knew something about it, it just totally blew us back.
Neil basically said, okay, this is what happened.
Swinging swords in the steam tunnels was no longer cutting it for Neil and his dungeon master, James Upchurch. They want a bolder quest.
They decided that we can use one of these Dungeons and Dragons scenarios as a blueprint for an actual crime.
There's even a pot of gold at the end of this adventure. In the dead of night in Raleigh, North Carolina, 1988, 2 college students are still awake. They're not cramming for an exam. They're planning an adventure.
We're just playing, and nobody's going to take us serious, but they were dead serious.
James Upchurch and Neil Henderson are devising a real-life Dungeons and Dragons quest to kill Leith von Stein. And there's a golden prize at the end of this mission.
In the Dungeons and Dragons book, it talks about the evil prince, and killing the evil prince, you get the treasure. They just wanted to live the good life. And they realized that Chris's father had almost $2 million.
Neil Henderson has just confessed to his part in the attack. Now he drops a bombshell on Washington police. There was a mastermind behind this deadly game. The victim's stepson, Chris Pritchard. Chris denies any involvement, and his mom, Bonnie, stands by her son.
She could not believe that her son, her eldest child, would even contemplate such a thing.
So detectives conduct a simple test.
We asked him if he could draw a map of his neighborhood, and he hand drew a map of his neighborhood, basically in the same style as one we found just after the murder.
They determined that the writing was Chris's handwriting.
Washington police finally unravel the truth behind this vicious attack.
This here's the master bedroom.
Chris Pritchard had enlisted his dungeon master, James Upchurch, to carry out a dangerous mission.
Where you will find the evil prince.
And I asked him simply, I said, what do you think about patricide? He immediately understood what I was talking about, and he said, what did you have in mind?
What Chris has in mind is to make his real-life worries disappear.
I was having a lot of difficulty at home with my family. It was so uncomfortable for me because of my abysmal grades.
He wasn't doing too well in college at the time.
Like many freshmen, Chris has fallen victim to the temptations of college life.
I had begun using alcohol much more heavily, much more regularly, and I had begun using other drugs as well.
And his stepfather, Leith, doesn't like it.
What the hell's your problem?
My dad was really upset about my grades. He felt like I was much more intelligent than my grades were reflecting.
You keep going the way you're going, and all you'll be good for is factory work.
Leith had basically told Chris, unless your grades improve, we're not going to pay for it anymore.
And I ain't wasting my money on your education.
Chris doesn't want to knuckle under. He wants the freedom to keep playing his favorite game.
He told me in no uncertain terms that that was unacceptable behavior, and that if I didn't do better, I might find myself in a factory job somewhere.
He and his stepfather start to constantly clash swords.
Jeez, watch what you're doing.
It was an accident.
Once that ultimatum was issued, I think the relationship between Chris and Leith turned for the worse.
I'll get a cloth. No. Let him do it.
Chris might be able to kick the booze and drugs, but he won't give up his obsession. Instead, he turns to Dungeons and Dragons for answers.
At some point that summer, I came up with this idea that I couldn't hurt my parents anymore if they weren't alive. That's how twisted my thinking had become. I approached Upchurch with this idea to kill my family.
Kill the evil prince and you'll get the treasure.
Dungeon Master James Upchurch agrees. He enlists teammate Neil Henderson as his driver, and Chris promises them both a rich reward.
So how much is that again?
50,000 each.
He offered them a share of the almost $2 million that Leith had.
In a car of your choice. Ferrari.
I offered each of them a car, an expensive car.
Porsche.
I think I told one of them I'd give them a Porsche and the other one a Ferrari, and then money on top of that.
Cheers, boys.
They'll have to make haste because Chris has a pressing problem.
One of the reasons I had for wanting to kill my parents was because I had a term paper due. Their death would get me out of having to complete this course. I could then drop the class, not have the bad grade, and thus not disappoint my parents again.
On July 24th, 1988, the boys' own adventure begins.
They left Raleigh in Chris Pritchard's Mustang.
Chris stays well away from the action.
The night of the crime, I was in Raleigh establishing an alibi.
Chris had enough forethought to plan it where he would not be anywhere around Washington when the attacks happened. He would be safely up in Raleigh or NC State where people would see him.
Chris sets up a board game with his friends.
I stayed up late. I was keeping 2 other students up late on purpose. They both repeatedly tried to go to bed, and I didn't want them to because I was attempting to establish a timeline. After I finally decided that, okay, enough time's passed, so I let them go to sleep.
Chris supplied James Upchurch and Neil Henderson with the key to the house and the map.
I told them where people slept, how to access the house. I gave them a key.
Upchurch went in the back door. He went upstairs, went in the bedroom, and he started hitting Leith with the bat.
Bonnie was awakened by the actual sounds of the attack.
She woke up to Leith screaming.
Once she was awake, the attacker turned his attention toward her.
In a matter of minutes, the frenzied attack is over. Upchurch thinks the job is done.
And they started driving back to Raleigh. And it was at that point that they made the decision to go down the side road and dump the map and the clothing and the knife and burn it.
As dawn breaks, Chris gets a frantic phone call from his sister Angela, and reality sets in.
It was at that point when reality forced its way past fantasy. It was at that point I realized that I had just done something that couldn't be redone. When I saw my mother in intensive care lying there with tubes, helping her to breathe, tubes giving her blood because she had lost blood, stitches on her forehead, I knew I had caused it. I had done what I saw. I didn't know what to do, so the only thing I could do was stick with the plan. That's all I could think. Stick with the plan, just stick with the plan.
For months, Chris lives a lie, unable to come clean to his heartbroken mom and sister. After Neil Henderson reveals the truth, Chris finally breaks.
I confess because I was glad to finally be able to tell the truth.
When he finally looked her in the face and confessed, it just ripped her soul apart.
2 years after the attack on his mother and stepfather, Chris Pritchard is found guilty of murder in the 2nd degree and sentenced to life in prison.
The case is a sad one because it's clearly the case of a kid who lost his way.
As for his fellow Dungeons & Dragons fanatics, Neil Henderson takes a plea deal and serves 10 years behind bars. Dungeon Master James Upchurch refuses to admit his role in the murder. He's sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison.
It raises the question of obsession, to the extent to which anyone who has an interest in a hobby or an activity or sport, how much do they let it totally consume their lives?
Most people who were playing in it didn't turn it into reality. Chris and the others involved took it beyond role-playing and turned it into a real-life situation, and it was a tragic situation.
After 17 years behind bars, Chris Pritchard is paroled in 2007 and reunites with his mom, Bonnie.
Since then, she has forgiven him. That shows you the power of a mother's love.
She supported me, she loved me, she held me accountable for my actions, but she made it possible for me to continue to have a relationship with her.
Chris is no longer tempted by dark forces.
Since the crime, I have not played the game. Today, I'm not interested in fantasy. Today, I'm interested in facts. Today, I'm interested in helping other people to deal with whatever problems they have had in their past so that they don't repeat their mistakes. I don't have to hurt anybody else anymore.
It's early 1968 in Portland, Oregon. And 19-year-old Linda Slauson
Hi, how are you today?
is starting out on a new career.
So she's going door to door selling encyclopedias, and I think at that point she hadn't sold a single one yet.
Pounding the pavements is no dream job. But finally, things are looking up. A door that isn't slammed in her face.
Great to get out of the weather.
Could this be her first customer?
These are the best encyclopedias you can ever buy for your children.
Somebody's finally invited you inside the house. You think you're about to make your first sale.
There will be no sale.
She's disappeared from planet Earth.
At first, no one's too worried. Selling door to door is a tough gig. Maybe Linda's gone back home to Minnesota.
It's not uncommon even today for people to simply disappear, for them to decide, I want to leave my life.
We always want to believe the best, when somebody disappears. And she just got tired of doing this and decided to go off.
Linda's not the only young woman to disappear. Over the next year, 3 other girls go missing around Portland and Salem.
These were women just like your wife, just like your daughter, just like your sister.
23-year-old Jan Whitney vanishes while heading home for Thanksgiving. Her car abandoned on the roadside.
It was a mystery. This car locked by the side of the road, the young lady gone, never to be found again.
22-year-old Linda Sally goes shopping and never comes home. 19-year-old college student Karen Sprinker doesn't make her lunch date.
A pre-med student who's planning to meet her mother, to have lunch, doesn't call, doesn't show up, simply disappears.
It's as though the earth opened up and swallowed them.
The police didn't have any clues. These women would just be there one moment and disappear the next moment. And there was no explanation as to where they had gone.
Police are mystified, and Portland is awash with fear. Is there a serial killer prowling the streets?
I don't think the police had the first clue about how bad this was.
In 1969, a chill wind is blowing through Portland, Oregon, and the neighboring town of Salem. 4 young, attractive women, all missing without a trace.
It was a simple town. It was much smaller than it is today, and it was full of people, I think, who had not seen the kinds of crimes that were being committed in bigger cities.
This crime will shatter the town's innocence. There is one lead. Reports of a mysterious figure in high heels.
Where Karen disappeared from, witnesses said that they had seen a very tall woman in the area at the time.
Is the attacker a woman? It's not that simple. This stranger is dictated by a dark temptation that was spawned 2 decades earlier. 5-year-old Jerry Brudos is playing dress-up, clomping around in a pair of his mother's high heels. It seems innocent enough, but Jerry's not just play-acting.
His mother had always wanted a daughter, and he was never treated properly by his family. He always felt like an outcast and never measure up. And so he started experimenting with his mother's clothing when he was very young, trying on her shoes.
Those shoes kickstart a lifelong obsession. According to criminal psychologist Dr. Eric Hickey, young Jerry thinks dressing like a girl might unlock his mother's cold heart.
If the shoes could be part of him and he could then identify with the shoes, and the shoes could identify with him, that he would be more acceptable to his mom.
Over the next decade, Jerry becomes fixated by the sensuous curve of a woman's shoe. An insatiable hunger so great that by the time he's a teenager, he breaks into homes just to steal heels.
He developed what you would call, I guess a psychologist would call it, a shoe fetish. So shoes and feet became one of the things that were his sexual fantasy items. There were times that he would don a pair of high heels and then he would pleasure himself.
His passion includes other items. Alone in his room, he tries on panties plucked from neighborhood clotheslines. His sexuality becomes fused with frills and silk.
It's not uncommon for young men, especially who are experimenting with their sexuality and their fantasies, to try on women's clothing. Most guys who do it might only do it once. But if they found it pleasurable, especially if they masturbate, that's going to recondition them to that fantasy and to that behavior.
Even as an adult, Jerry Brudos still hankers after high heels.
And the way that he would put them on his own feet, this big, huge, bulky man, but he apparently just loved the idea of sexual fantasies tied to women's shoes.
By 1962, Jerry's found himself a wife and started a family. But his fantasy is still all-consuming. When the shoe no longer fits, he asks his wife to dress up for him.
One of the things that Jerry did make his wife do, and she did comply, was he asked her or demanded of her that she clean the house. When she cleaned the house, that she do it in the nude. Again, wearing high-heeled shoes.
It's a kinky request. But as a housewife in the 60s, She's used to obeying her husband.
I think that she believed her husband has some very strange ideas about sex. But if that's all it was required to her to dress up once in a while and wear high-heel shoes, I suspect that she felt that she could do that in order to keep the marriage together.
Over the next few years, Jerry decides he needs more. Much more. In April of 1969, 24-year-old secretary Sharon Wood has lost her car.
I couldn't really remember which level in the garage the car was on. I certainly wasn't paying attention to my surroundings. Just kind of lost, kind of distracted and focused on something else.
Then, Sharon senses someone behind her.
He tapped me on my shoulder and said, "Ma'am," and I turned around to face a gun. And him saying,
"If you don't scream, I won't hurt you."
I just knew that I was going to die.
Sharon makes a split-second decision to fight back.
I started screaming as loud as I could. And he put his hand over my mouth, and somehow I bit down on his thumb. I bit down hard, and I could taste blood. Later on, they told me I probably got something called fear paralysis, because when my jaw locked down, I could not let go of him. And it's as if he was my captive.
Her attacker is big and powerful. He starts to get the upper hand. Sharon needs a miracle.
I saw a car coming out of the corner, and then he just took off.
In the frenzy of the fight, she can't identify her attacker for police. What Sharon doesn't realize is she's just escaped the clutches of a monster whose dark temptations are about to emerge from the depths.
The whole thing is gross and disgusting and hard to understand, really, how any human being could treat another person this way.
Oregon's Long Tom River has always been a rich hunting ground for anglers. In 1969, police discover it's also a dumping ground. When a grisly secret surfaces from the deep.
She had been tied to a piece of a car engine heavy enough to weight her down and take her down and deep in the river.
The body is identified as missing woman Linda Sally, last seen in a Portland shopping center 2 weeks earlier. A few days later, divers also find the remains of missing student Karen Sprinker.
We have victims taken from different places, found in the same general location, which suggests that it may have been the same person who murdered both of them.
Police have a crazed killer on the loose. And now they have one vital clue.
There was an unusual knot used to tie the bodies. It was the knot that electricians use.
Is the killer an electrician? It's still a wide net to cast. Detectives start by questioning students at Karen Sprinker's college. Some girls do remember a strange man on campus. The stranger was looking for a date and kept talking about the missing girls.
And they say, yes, there is a man who's been wandering around, and further identifying the man who was an electrician.
The electrician's name? Jerry Brudos.
Once the police were able to get the contact information for Jerry and his address, they went to visit him. He was married, had 2 kids, the all-American family. There was nothing really that made him stand out.
Until they see what Jerry keeps in his workshop. Amid the tools and machinery, a length of wire with a telltale knot.
He's an electrician. He has the same kind of rope that was used to tie the bodies to a piece of an engine block and drop them into a river and dispose of them. We may well have found our serial killer.
They also find a treasure trove of lingerie and more than 40 pairs of high-heel shoes. And when police open Jerry's toolbox, it is full of photos. Naked and scantily clad women. Cops recognize two faces: missing woman Jan Whitney and murdered girl Karen Sprinker.
You can tell where the photo was taken in his garage or workshop.
Under intense questioning, Jerry Brudos spills out his dark deeds. He admits snatching Karen Sprinker from a parking lot and bringing her back to his lair. Dressing her in his favorite heels and underwear.
Put them on.
To pose for a series of sick photos. Pictures that haunt journalist Lars Larson to this day.
She's standing there in a pair of high heels. She has what I would describe as a 1,000-yard stare. Her eyes are just blank, as though she's checked out. There must be at some level a recognition in her head. I'm already dead. He's put a noose around her neck. He's ratcheted her up close to the ceiling. Then he locks the door, goes inside, sits down, has dinner with his wife and his kids.
After all, there's no rush. Jerry knows his secret's safe because his workshop is a forbidden zone.
There was a part of Jerry Brudos' house.
Do not come out here.
That was off limits to his wife. It was his workshop. She would never go in there.
Police are incredulous. How could his wife be oblivious to the terrifying events unfolding in her husband's chamber of horrors?
The police looked hard at her to determine whether or not she had any knowledge, whether or not she cooperated, whether or not she aided or abetted him in hiding the crimes, and they determined that she had no involvement whatsoever in the crimes.
The horror doesn't end there.
I don't think the police had the first clue about how bad this was.
Jerry tells detectives his killing spree all began when young salesgirl Linda Slauson knocked on his door.
He invited her in.
Hi, how are you today?
He attacked Linda. He strangled her and killed her.
And that's when his dark temptation takes over.
He took the corpse, he cut off one of her feet. He put it in a freezer so he could freeze it and then put it into a shoe, a high-heeled shoe. That's referred to as a trophy. And it's something that is great, great value to him. So by putting the foot into a high-heeled shoe, that was very attractive to him. And then he knew that he could go downstairs anytime he wanted, get that shoe out of the freezer and touch it and masturbate and fantasize about that woman.
The rest of Linda is discarded, never to be found.
He made a comment one time that women are like candy. Once you've had the candy, you just discard the wrapper.
Jerry also confesses to killing Jan Whitney after he spots her stranded on the roadside.
It's very opportunistic for him. There's a broken down car that needs attention, and he abducts a woman that way.
Those first 2 kills came down to luck. But now Jerry needs to feed his growing hunger.
He can't simply wait for other victims to come to him. He needs to go out and find those other victims. At that point, Jerry Brudos turns into a predator.
Jerry hunts down Sharon Wood. Her bravery saves her. Two days later, in another parking lot, Brudos kidnaps and kills Linda Sally.
She was going out shopping for her boyfriend and never returned. And they found her car also abandoned.
Jerry Brudos saw these beautiful young women as mere mannequins for his beloved shoes. In June 1969, he pleads guilty to the murders of Karen Sprinker, Jan Whitney, and Linda Sally. He is given 3 consecutive life sentences.
Jerry Brudos started with women's shoes. He ended with some of the most unspeakable murders that you could possibly imagine, even by today's standards of serial killers.
Even in prison, he can't control his temptations.
He would order catalogs of shoes from companies because he wanted to surround himself with these magazines where he could look at shoes and fantasize and probably masturbate to those fantasies.
In March 2006, at age 67, Jerry Brudos dies of cancer in prison. His dark temptation cut down 4 young women in their prime and left another scarred for life.
Who knows why some people live and others die? I don't know. Even now, I don't know. And I feel very badly for those families and those young women who didn't get to have a life. And I'm grateful for mine.